One of the hardest things to accept in life is that things don't always happen when we want them to. We live in a world that thrives on instant gratification, fast food, express shipping, on-demand entertainment. If we have to wait too long for something, we start questioning if it's even worth it. But God doesn't operate on human timelines. He sees the full picture while we only see a small fragment. When we pray for something, we often have a specific time frame in mind. We think, God, I need this job by next month, or Lord, I need this breakthrough by the end of the year. And when it doesn't happen in that window, we assume something is wrong. We wonder if God heard us or if He's forgotten about us. But what we fail to realize is that God's delays are often divine positioning. He is orchestrating things behind the scenes, working in ways we can't see. Look at the story of Joseph in the Bible. He had a dream as a young man that he would be in a position of power. But instead of immediate success, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and later imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. From the outside, it looked like his dream was getting further and further away. But what seemed like a series of delays was actually God's way of preparing him for the right moment. When the time was perfect, Joseph was elevated to second in command in Egypt, a position that not only fulfilled his dream, but also saved an entire nation from famine. If Joseph had been promoted too soon, he wouldn't have been ready. The experiences he went through built the wisdom, character, and resilience he needed for his calling. Sometimes God holds things back because we aren't prepared for them yet. If He gave us what we wanted right away, we might not have the maturity, the discipline, or the faith to handle it. A blessing given too soon can become a burden. Just like a parent doesn't hand the car keys to a 10-year-old, God doesn't release certain things until we're ready. There are also times when the delay has nothing to do with us, but everything to do with the people or circumstances around us. Maybe God is still aligning certain relationships, opening the right doors or closing the wrong ones. Sometimes the opportunity isn't ready for you yet. And if you step into it too soon, it won't be what it's meant to be. When we face delays in life, our natural reaction is often frustration, disappointment, or even doubt. We assume that if something hasn't happened yet, it must not be God's will for us. But a delay is not the same as a denial. Just because something hasn't arrived in our lives doesn't mean it's never going to happen. In many cases, what looks like a no from God is actually a not yet. Think about how a farmer plants seeds. The moment he places the seed in the ground, he doesn't expect to see a full-grown harvest the next day. He understands that growth takes time. There's a process of watering, nurturing, and waiting before he sees the fruit of his labor. In the same way, God sometimes plants a promise in our hearts, but it takes time for that promise to develop and come to fruition. If the farmer dug up the seed too soon, he would miss the harvest. Likewise, if we give up too early because we don't see immediate results, we can forfeit the very thing God was preparing for us. Abraham and Sarah are a perfect example of this. God promised them a child, but years passed with no sign of fulfillment. The delay tested their faith, and at one point they tried to take matters into their own hands. But God had not forgotten His promise. Even though it seemed impossible, Sarah was well past childbearing age. God fulfilled His word at exactly the right time. The delay wasn't a denial. It was a divine setup for a supernatural miracle. Sometimes a delay is actually God's way of protecting us. We may think we're ready for something, but He knows what's ahead. If we got that promotion too soon, we might crumble under the pressure. If we entered that relationship prematurely, we might not be equipped to handle it. What we perceive as a delay is often God's way of shielding us from unnecessary pain or preparing us for a greater opportunity. We also have to remember that spiritual opposition can play a role in delays. In the book of Daniel, the angel bringing Daniel's answer was delayed for 21 days due to spiritual warfare. The answer was on its way, but there was a battle in the unseen realm. This reminds us that just because we don't see movement doesn't mean nothing is happening. God is always working, even when it seems like nothing is changing. Faith is easy when everything is happening according to our schedule, when prayers are answered quickly, when doors open without resistance, and when life unfolds the way we expected. Trusting God feels natural, but real faith is tested in the waiting. It's when time keeps passing and there's no sign of change, no visible progress, and no clear answer that faith is truly put to the test. Trusting beyond the timeline means believing even when there's no indication that things are moving in our favor. It means standing firm when the deadline has come and gone, when the opportunity seems lost, when logic tells us it's too late. Faith is not based on what we see, it's based on who God is. If we only trust when we can track progress, we're not really walking by faith, we're walking by sight. But faith says, even though I don't see it, I believe it. Even though the clock is ticking, I know God is still in control. Look at Noah. God told him to build an ark because a flood was coming, yet there was no sign of rain. Days turned into months, and months turned into years. People mocked him, and nothing in the natural supported what he was doing. But Noah didn't base his obedience on what he could see. He based it on what God said. He kept building, trusting that God's promise would come to pass, even when it seemed like nothing was happening. The same principle applies to our lives. Maybe you've been praying for a breakthrough, and it feels like the window of opportunity is closed. Maybe you've been waiting for a promise to be fulfilled, and every logical sign points to the fact that it's too late. But faith doesn't have an expiration date. Faith keeps believing even when circumstances look impossible. Abraham was given a promise that he would be the father of many nations, yet he had to wait decades before Isaac was born. David was anointed as king, yet he spent years running from Saul before he ever sat on the throne. Joseph had a dream of ruling, but he endured betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment before stepping into his destiny. In every case, the waiting period was part of God's plan. Faith is trusting that just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It's resisting the urge to give up when things take longer than expected. It's holding on to the promise even when the circumstances don't match the vision. Waiting can feel like wasted time. When we don't see immediate progress, it's easy to wonder if anything is happening at all. We ask God, why is this taking so long? Or did I miss my moment? But what we often fail to realize is that God isn't just making us wait, He's using the waiting to prepare us. Every delay has a purpose. Every season of waiting is shaping, refining, and equipping us for what's ahead. Think about David. He was anointed as king while he was still a shepherd boy. But he didn't take the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years tending sheep, playing music for Saul, and even running for his life. To the outside world, it may have seemed like nothing was happening, but God was using that time to prepare him. The battles David fought in private, the lions and the bears he killed while protecting his flock, were preparing him for the giant he would later defeat in public. If David had stepped into kingship too soon, he wouldn't have had the strength, wisdom, or leadership skills needed to rule a nation. The waiting wasn't punishment, it was preparation. Many times we pray for a blessing, but we're not yet ready to handle it. We ask God for a promotion, but we still need to develop the character and discipline required for the next level. We want to step into a relationship, but there's still healing and growth that needs to take place within us. God knows what's coming, and He knows what we'll need when we get there. He doesn't just want to give us a blessing. He wants us to be able to sustain it. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before leading Israel out of Egypt. Joseph endured betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment before stepping into his position of power. Even Jesus spent 30 years in preparation before launching his ministry. In every case, God wasn't delaying their destiny. He was developing them for it. Sometimes the most valuable lessons happen in the waiting. We learn patience, humility, and dependence on God. We develop faith that isn't based on circumstances, but on trust in His timing. What feels like a season of stillness is actually a season of growth. The roots are going deeper, the foundation is getting stronger, and the capacity to carry the blessing is being built. Life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges our way. Just when we think everything is going according to plan, we hit a roadblock, a door closes, a relationship falls apart, an opportunity slips through our fingers. In those moments, it's easy to feel discouraged and wonder why things didn't work out. But what if the setback wasn't meant to stop you, but to set you up for something greater? What if what looks like a disappointment is actually positioning you for a breakthrough? Joseph's life is a perfect example of this. He had a dream that one day he would be in a position of great influence. But before that dream became reality, he faced betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. It seemed like every time he took a step forward, something knocked him 2 steps back. But what looked like setbacks were actually setups. Being sold into slavery put him in Egypt. Being falsely accused and thrown into prison placed him in the exact position where he would eventually interpret Pharaoh's dream. And that interpretation led to his promotion as second in command over all of Egypt. If Joseph hadn't faced those setbacks, he wouldn't have been in the right place at the right time to step into his destiny. Sometimes we pray for a blessing and instead we experience loss. We ask God for a new opportunity and instead a door slams shut. We assume that because things didn't go our way, we must have missed out. But what if the closed door is actually a redirection? What if God is using what seems like a failure to push us into something bigger than we imagine? Look at the story of Lazarus. His sisters, Mary and Martha, sent word to Jesus that he was sick. They expected Jesus to come immediately and heal him, but instead, Jesus delayed. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. It looked like all hope was gone. But Jesus didn't just come to heal, he came to resurrect. What seemed like the ultimate setback was really a setup for a greater demonstration of God's power. If Lazarus had only been sick and then healed, it would have been a miracle. But raising him from the dead was a testimony that changed lives. Sometimes what we think is a setback is actually a stage being set for God to do something beyond what we could imagine. The disappointment, the delay, even the heartbreak, none of it is wasted. God is not just restoring what was lost, He is preparing something greater than what was taken away. The very thing that seemed like a roadblock could be the very thing that launches you into your destiny. The bigger the challenge, the greater the glory that follows. One of the greatest challenges of faith is trusting that God is working, even when we can't see any evidence of it. We often measure progress by what is visible, doors opening, opportunities coming, prayers being answered in obvious ways. But God is not limited to what we can see. He is always orchestrating things behind the scenes, aligning people, shifting circumstances, and preparing breakthroughs long before they appear in our reality. In the book of Esther, we see a perfect example of God working behind the scenes. Esther was an ordinary Jewish girl who became queen in a foreign land. At the same time, a man named Haman plotted to destroy the Jewish people. On the surface, it looked like disaster was inevitable. There were no miracles, no visible signs of divine intervention. But while it seemed like nothing was happening, God was putting everything in place. He gave Esther favor with the king. He positioned Mordecai in the right place at the right time. He caused the king to have a sleepless night that led to Mordecai's recognition. Step by step, without any dramatic miracles, God was working behind the scenes to turn the entire situation around. By the time the enemy's plan was exposed, everything was already in position for victory. Many times we expect God to work in ways that are obvious and immediate. We want to see movement, signs, and breakthroughs right away. But God often works in the unseen. A delay might not be a denial. It might be a divine strategy. The connection you need, the opportunity you've been praying for, or the solution to your problem might already be in motion, but you just can't see it yet. Think about a seed planted in the ground. When a farmer plants a seed, he doesn't stand there and demand to see growth immediately. He understands that the seed is working beneath the soil, developing roots and preparing to break through. Just because nothing is visible above the ground doesn't mean the process isn't happening. The same is true with God. He is moving, working, shifting things in ways that are beyond our understanding. The story of Joseph is another powerful example. While he was in prison, it looked like nothing was changing. But what he didn't know was that his name was being discussed in Pharaoh's palace. What seemed like years of being forgotten were actually years of preparation. At the right time, God brought Joseph from the prison to the palace in a single day. Right now, there may be prayers you've been praying for years, and it feels like nothing is changing. But just because you can't see the answer doesn't mean God isn't working. The people you need to meet, the favor you need, the opportunities that will open, God is already aligning them. He is working behind the scenes. And at the right moment, everything will come together in ways greater than you imagine. No matter where you are in life, No matter what you've been through, your story is not over. It's easy to look at past disappointments, failures, and delays and assume that things will always be this way. You might think that because a dream hasn't come to pass or because a door has closed, your best days are behind you. But the truth is, God is still writing your story. What looks like the end is often just a chapter, not the conclusion. Think about a book. If you stop reading halfway through, you might assume the main character will never overcome their struggles. You might think they'll never reach their goal, never find happiness, never step into their purpose. But if you keep reading, you'll see that what looked like defeat was actually part of their journey. The setbacks, the challenges, the delays, all of it was leading to a greater ending than they could have imagined. The same is true in your life. Just because this chapter has been difficult doesn't mean the next one won't be full of breakthroughs, blessings, and new beginnings. Moses thought his story was over when he fled Egypt after killing a man. He spent 40 years in the wilderness, likely believing that he had missed his chance, that his purpose had passed him by. But God wasn't finished with him. The very place where he thought his life had ended, on the backside of the desert, was where God called him to lead the Israelites out of bondage. What Moses thought was the closing chapter was just the setup for the most important part of his story. Maybe you feel like you've made too many mistakes. Maybe you think you've missed too many opportunities. But God is not limited by your past. He is the author of your story, and He knows how to redeem, restore, and rewrite what seems broken. What you see as a failure, God sees as a lesson. What you see as a loss, God sees as preparation for what's ahead. Look at Job. He lost everything, his wealth, his health, and even his family. If you had looked at his life in the middle of his suffering, you would have thought his story was ending in tragedy, but God was still writing. In the later chapters of his life, Job was restored with double what he had lost. His suffering wasn't the final sentence. It was part of a greater testimony. Right now, you may be in a season of waiting, uncertainty, or struggle, but this is not the final page. God is still unfolding His plan. What feels like an ending might just be the turning point. The delays, the disappointments, the detours, they are all part of a bigger picture. He is weaving everything together into a story far greater than you could have imagined. Keep trusting, keep believing, and keep turning the pages. Faith is not just about believing that God can do something. It's about trusting Him even when we don't see immediate results. True faith isn't proven in moments of quick answers or instant breakthroughs. It's proven in the waiting. Patience is the evidence that we trust God's timing over our own. It's easy to say we have faith when everything is falling into place, but the real test comes when things seem to be standing still. Patience means we don't panic when things take longer than expected. It means we don't get discouraged when doors remain closed. It means we don't try to force our way into something that isn't ready yet. It's in these seasons of waiting that God refines our faith, making it stronger and more unshakable. Faith without patience is fragile. It crumbles under pressure. But when patience and faith work together, they produce endurance, maturity, and a deeper trust in God. Abraham is known as the father of faith, but his journey required great patience. God promised him a son, yet years passed with no child in sight. There were moments when doubt crept in, moments when impatience led him to take matters into his own hands, but God still fulfilled His word. Isaac was born at the appointed time, not when Abraham expected, but when God had perfectly planned. If the promise had come too soon, Abraham wouldn't have been fully prepared to steward it. Waiting is never easy, but it's in the waiting that God develops us. He uses delays to strengthen our trust, to refine our character, and to prepare us for what's ahead. Just like a farmer doesn't rush the harvest before it's time, God doesn't release His blessings prematurely. He knows when we're ready. Joseph had to be patient when he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and wrongfully imprisoned. Every setback could have made him doubt God's plan. But through it all, Joseph remained faithful. He didn't let impatience make him bitter or cause him to turn away from God. And when the time was right, he stepped into a position of authority, fulfilling the very dream God had given him years earlier. His patience allowed him to walk into his destiny with wisdom and humility. Sometimes we want the blessing but not the process. We want the promise without the patience. But God sees what we cannot. He knows that if we rush into something before it's time, it won't be sustainable. Patience is what keeps us rooted in faith when the waiting seems endless. It's what allows us to hold on to hope even when circumstances don't make sense. It's what proves that our trust is in God, not in our own understanding, not in a specific timeline, but in His perfect plan. In life, we often feel like time is running out. We set our own deadlines, expecting God to move within our schedule. When things don't happen as quickly as we hope, we start to question if we missed our moment. We wonder if God has forgotten about us or if we did something wrong. But God is never early and He is never late. His timing is always perfect. From our limited perspective, delays seem like obstacles. We see unanswered prayers as signs that nothing is happening. But God sees the full picture. He knows exactly when to bring things to pass. If He opens a door too soon, we might not be ready to walk through it. If He brings a blessing before we're prepared, we may not have the capacity to handle it. God's timing isn't just about us getting what we want. It's about us being ready for what He has in store. Think about Lazarus. When he became sick, his sisters, Mary and Martha, sent word to Jesus, expecting Him to come immediately, but Jesus delayed. By the time He arrived, Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days. To everyone watching, it seemed too late. The situation looked hopeless, but Jesus had a greater plan. He didn't just come to heal Lazarus, He came to resurrect him. What seemed like a delay was actually a divine setup for a miracle that would bring even greater glory. Moses' journey also reveals God's precise timing. He spent 40 years in the wilderness before God called him to lead Israel out of Egypt. From a human standpoint, it looked like he had wasted years of his life. But those years were not wasted. They were preparation. God was shaping his character, teaching him leadership, and preparing him for the assignment ahead. When the time was right, not a moment too soon or too late, God spoke to him through the burning bush and sent him on his mission. We see the same principle in the life of Joseph. As a young man, he had a dream that he would one day be in a position of great influence. But before that dream was fulfilled, he faced betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. It seemed like his life was moving in the opposite direction of what God had promised. But every challenge was leading him toward his destiny. At just the right time, Pharaoh had a dream that only Joseph could interpret. And in a single day, he went from prison to palace. If Joseph had been released earlier, he wouldn't have been in position for the promotion. If he had been set free too late, the opportunity would have passed. God's timing is not based on our deadlines, our expectations, or our impatience. He sees what we cannot see. He knows the right moment for every breakthrough, every promotion, every relationship, and every miracle. He is never early because He won't give us something before we're ready. He is never late because He will not let us miss what He has planned. When we trust His timing, we can rest knowing that everything is unfolding exactly as it should. There are moments in life when it feels like the story is coming to an end. The dream seems impossible, the door is shut, the relationship is broken, the opportunity is gone. In those moments, it's easy to believe that it's over. But with God, what looks like the end is often just the beginning. When it seems like all hope is lost, that's when He steps in and does something greater than we could have imagined. Look at the story of Lazarus. When he became sick, his sisters sent word to Jesus, expecting Him to come and heal their brother. But instead of arriving immediately, Jesus delayed. By the time He showed up, Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days. To everyone around, it was over. The funeral had already happened, the stone had been rolled over the tomb, and people had accepted that nothing more could be done. But what they saw as the final chapter was only the setup for a greater miracle. Jesus didn't just come to heal, He came to resurrect. If He had arrived earlier, they would have seen a healing, but because He waited, they witnessed a resurrection. Think about the Israelites at the Red Sea. They had just escaped Egypt and everything seemed to be going well, but suddenly Pharaoh changed his mind and sent his army to bring them back. Trapped between the sea in front of them and the enemy behind them, they felt like it was over. There was no way out, but what looked like a dead end was actually a divine setup. God parted the Red Sea, making a way where there was no way. What seemed like the end of their freedom became the very moment they stepped into a new beginning. Joseph's life tells the same story. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, wrongfully imprisoned, it seemed like his dreams had been crushed. Every situation pointed to failure. But just when it looked like his story was over, God was positioning him for something greater. In one moment, he was taken from the prison and placed in the palace, stepping into the very promise God had given him years before. Even Jesus' crucifixion seemed like the ultimate defeat. His followers watched him die on the cross, his body placed in a tomb, and the stone rolled into place. To them, it was over. The one they had followed, the one they had believed in was gone. But what they didn't realize was that God was just getting started. On the third day, the stone was rolled away and Jesus rose from the dead, proving that not even death could stop God's plan. What looks like an ending in your life may actually be the setup for a greater testimony. The closed doors, the disappointments, the seasons of waiting, none of them mean that God is finished. He specializes in bringing life to dead situations, turning setbacks into comebacks, and making a way when there is no way. When it looks over, that's when He's just getting started.